Hollywood will let a leading man kill on screen, cry on screen, burn cities on screen, but ask him to be held by another man, and suddenly it's too risky. Tonight, we're breaking down the straight tax, the invisible fee A-list men pay to keep their masculinity legible, 10 refusals, 10 anxieties, and one question you're going to argue about is saying no a personal right or a privilege protected by prejudice. 1. Joaquin Phoenix. The exit that didn't just hurt a scene, it nuked a whole film. Hollywood is built for mistakes you can fix in the edit. A bad line, ADR, a messy headline, a PR reset. But in August 2024, the industry got the kind of panic you can't color correct. A movie with no star. Joaquin Phoenix was set to lead Todd Haynes' gay romance, and then, reported by multiple outlets, he dropped out 5 days before production was due to start in Mexico. And what makes it feel so silent fame is how quickly the story stops being about art and becomes about fear. This wasn't a coy winking the no-homo coded character. Reports described an explicit love story between men, tender, physical, undeniable. That's where Hollywood's straight leading man machine still glitches. Not at violence, not at madness, not at being a villain, but at being held. At being seen as soft on camera. When a star backs out that late, it's not just personal, it's economic shrapnel. Schedules collapse, crews scatter, money burns, and queer stories, already treated like specialty projects, get labeled risky all over again. The most brutal part? The silence is always framed as complicated, as if the damage is an unfortunate weather event instead of a choice. Todd Haynes later addressed the fallout publicly, which tells you how big the wound was. So here's the uncomfortable question the industry doesn't want audiences asking. If an A-list actor can walk away from a queer love story and the project effectively flatlines, what does that say about who is actually protected in Hollywood and who is still expendable? Say it in the comments. When a star signs on, then bails at the edge, do you see personal boundaries? Or do you see a system where queer intimacy is still treated like career poison? 2. Terrence Howard. When a boundary sounds like a threat and the mask slips. Sometimes Hollywood hides behind contracts. Sometimes it hides behind silence. And sometimes an actor says one sentence so violent it exposes the whole architecture underneath. In April 2025, Terrence Howard explained why he declined playing Marvin Gaye in a biopic. He said if he had to kiss a man on screen, he would cut my lips off. The quote went viral because it didn't sound like acting talk, it sounded like contamination talk. Like intimacy isn't a performance, but a stain. And then came the cleanup. Howard insisted it wasn't homophobia, that he can't fake it, that he can't commit to a place he doesn't understand. Here's what makes this bigger than one man. Hollywood has always trained straight male stars to treat queer vulnerability as the one thing that can't be washed off. You can play a killer and still be a hero. You can play cruel and still be a heartthrob. But let the camera catch you choosing another man, tenderly, willingly, and suddenly your brand is at risk. Roles get quieter, deals get cautious. You don't get publicly blacklisted, you just get softly removed from the future. And the Marvin Gaye angle adds gasoline, because even the rumor of queerness becomes a trigger. Reports about Howard's story mention he was influenced by talk around gay sexuality, amplified through the culture's obsession with labeling. Meanwhile, Howard also called turning it down the biggest mistake of his career, because it cost him other opportunities too, like playing Smokey Robinson. That's the irony. The straight tax doesn't just punish queer people. it also makes straight men amputate their own range. Your turn. Is "I can't kiss a man" a valid personal line? Or is it a confession that the masculinity Hollywood sells is so fragile it can't survive 2 seconds of love? 3. Will Smith. The kiss he dodged, and the lesson that followed him for decades. Before the franchises, before the global box office chess moves, Will Smith was still negotiating permission to be a serious actor and permission to be seen. In 6 Degrees of Separation, 1993, Smith's character isn't a joke, isn't a sidekick. He's magnetic, layered, and dangerously intimate. The story called for a same-sex kiss, and Smith didn't do it. The scene was reportedly cheated with camera staging, an illusion designed to protect a rising star from one moment of queer-coded vulnerability. Years later, Smith didn't dress it up as principle. He called it very immature, admitting he was thinking about how his friends back in Philly would react and saying he wasn't emotionally stable enough to commit artistically. Either you do it or you don't. That line hits like a punch because it tells you the real censor wasn't the studio. It was the hometown jury. That invisible tribunal of men who can revoke your masculinity with one laugh. And for a young black star in the early 90s, that fear wasn't abstract. The industry already policed black masculinity with a microscope. Be strong, be desirable, be safe for mainstream audiences, and never give them a reason to call you soft. One queer moment could be turned into a brand label, and labels in Hollywood become cages. The scar stayed visible. Ian McKellen later confronted Smith about the refusal because artists can feel when truth gets swapped for safety. Smith went on to become one of the biggest movie stars alive. But this story still follows him because it's not just about a kiss. It's about the one transformation Hollywood still let him believe he couldn't afford. So argue in the comments. Do you respect that he was young and scared? Or do you judge it because acting is literally transformation, and "I can't kiss a man" is the one limit leading men keep drawing in permanent ink? 4. Brad Pitt. When the world's perfect straight fantasy was offered a love story and said no. There's a particular kind of power Hollywood gives to a man like Brad Pitt at his peak. Not just fame, myth. You're not an actor anymore. You're a product people project themselves onto. Men want to be you. Women are told to want you. And the studios build an entire economy around keeping that fantasy unbroken. That's why this casting story still stings. Director Gus Van Sant has said that when he was working on Brokeback Mountain early on, he tried to assemble a famous cast and asked the usual suspects, including Pitt, and they said no. And here's the wild secret about Brokeback. It wasn't always treated like sacred cinema. For a long time, it floated around Hollywood as a risky script, the kind people loved on paper, but wouldn't commit to in public. Even years later, the cultural memory still carried that ugly punchline energy, gay cowboy movie, before the world fully admitted it was a landmark love story. So imagine the alternate timeline. The most desired man alive playing a man whose desire is directed at another man. Not as a gag, not as one scene, a full romance. Would it have shattered the fantasy or made it bigger? Would his career have taken damage in 2005 when tabloid culture and global box office were already punishing anything that looked too queer? Or would it have proven that the fantasy was never fragile to begin with? No one can read Pitt's mind. Maybe it was timing. Maybe it was script. Maybe it was a normal career choice. But in that era, normal choices were shaped by a very specific fear. The fear that tenderness between men isn't just acting, it's a label the audience won't let you wash off. Drop your verdict in the comments. If you were the biggest heartthrob on earth, would you risk your entire brand for one love story? or protect the fantasy and let history pick someone else. 5. Leonardo DiCaprio, the pretty boy who ran from softness and almost ran past the perfect role. Leo's post-Titanic years were basically a public exorcism. He spent the 2000s trying to murder the idea that he was just a pretty face in a waterlogged romance. The roles got darker, colder, louder, anything that said, "I'm not your teen idol anymore." And then Brokeback Mountain comes knocking in the early casting chaos, and Gus Van Sant later said DiCaprio was one of the A-list men he approached who turned it down. That's the irony that makes this story so haunting. A repressed, terrified ranch hand in 1960s Wyoming isn't soft. It's brutal. It's lonely. It's a man trapped inside the rules of masculinity until the rules start eating him alive. Today, critics talk about Brokeback as a tragic masterpiece, about the cost of repression, the violence behind the silence. So, what was the real risk for Leo? Was it the fear that playing queer would feel like sliding back into a pretty boy box he was desperate to escape? Was it the industry whisper that the audience wouldn't follow him there? Or was it simply one of those boring scheduling realities that get retroactively turned into legend? The question that keeps viewers arguing is this: if an actor's job is transformation, why did Hollywood treat this one transformation like a career hazard for so many A-listers? And if Leo had done it, would he have unlocked a tenderness in his filmography we rarely get to see? Comment your take. Did he dodge a trap? Or did he dodge the one role that could have rewritten his entire emotional range? 6. @Damon. The moment Hollywood turned queerness into a spreadsheet problem. Matt Damon's story is the cleanest window into how the straight tax actually works, because he basically admits the math. He was close with Gus Van Sant, and Damon has recalled telling him some version of, "I just did a gay movie and a cowboy movie. I can't do a gay cowboy movie now." Read that again. Not "I won't," not "I'm disgusted," just brand sequencing. Like intimacy is a PR risk you have to schedule around. And the fun secret people forget is that Brokeback was bouncing around for years, loved but not claimed, before it finally landed with Ang Lee and the cast that made it immortal. So Damon wasn't turning down a guaranteed classic. He was turning down a question mark that the industry kept treating like a bomb. And to be fair, you can understand the fear. In that era, straight men who touched queer romance got turned into headlines. Not reviews, headlines. Your private life gets interrogated, your masculinity gets policed. The audience thinks it owns you, and Hollywood quietly rewards you for staying legible. But here's where it gets complicated. Damon wasn't some anti-queer caricature. He had already played characters that brushed up against queerness and ambiguity. The fear wasn't the role, it was the order, the optics, the way the machine might relabel him. So what do you call that? Smart career management? Cowardice? Or just proof that Hollywood trained even decent men to treat queer intimacy like radioactive material? Tell me in the comments where you land. And if you want the rest of this list and the receipts, with the same deep dive storytelling, hit subscribe. Silent Fame doesn't do gossip. We map the system that makes silence profitable. 7. Kevin Hart. The confession that sounded like honesty and like a cage. Kevin Hart is one of the rare men on this list who didn't hide behind a fancy excuse. He didn't say, "It's not the right fit." He didn't pretend it was scheduling. He said the quiet part out loud. He turned down a role because he knew he wouldn't dive into that role 100% due to insecurities about playing gay. That sentence is basically a receipt for the straight tax. Because what is that tax really? It's the invisible fee Hollywood charges straight male stars to keep their brand legible to the crowd. Pay it, and you stay safe. Refuse to pay it, get ready to be watched, decoded, memed, and rebranded by strangers who think one scene tells them everything about you. Hart's whole persona was built like armor: loud confidence, dominance, constant motion. But his honesty exposes the vulnerability underneath. He wasn't saying, "I hate gay people." He was saying, "I don't trust the world to let me live after they see me like that." And that's the twist Silent Fame lives for, because it's uglier than simple homophobia. It's a man admitting he's been trained to fear visibility itself. Here's the part that gets people arguing. Is that humility? Or is it cowardice dressed as self-awareness? Because actors transform for a living. They play killers, addicts, monsters, and nobody assumes that's who they are. Yet for generations, a man kissing a man on screen has been treated like a confession instead of a performance. Not because the role is shameful, because the audience has been taught that softness in men is suspicious, and Kevin didn't just pay the tax once. When you build your brand around policing masculinity, it doesn't stay in the script. It bleeds into your comedy, your tweets, your jokes. Years later, the culture came back around and said, "We heard you, we remember." And the backlash proved his original fear wasn't imaginary. It was structural. So let's leave the verdict open on purpose. If you're Kevin Hart, do you respect the boundary because honesty is rare? Or do you call it a privileged fear because queer actors never get to opt out of being seen in the first place? Drop your take. Is refusing a queer role a personal right? Or a luxury protected by stigma? 8 on Mark Wahlberg. Creeped out, when the straight tax speaks in one word. Mark Wahlberg didn't write an essay about authentic casting. He didn't cloak it in progressive language. He said something simpler, and that simplicity is what makes it sting. Talking about Brokeback Mountain, Wahlberg recalled meeting with Ong Lee, reading pages of the script, and getting a little creeped out, calling it very graphic. Creeped out is not a neutral phrase. It's not just discomfort, it's moral static. It's the reflex some men have when intimacy between men isn't hidden behind a gee, joke, or a wink. And this is why Wahlberg is such a perfect straight tax case study. He didn't describe the role as challenging, brave, or complicated. He described it like something that could get on him. Here's the secret people forget. Before Brokeback became legend, it was a script passed around like a live wire. Hollywood loved it privately and feared it publicly. It wasn't safe prestige yet. It was that gay cowboy thing in an era where the industry still believed a straight heartthrob could lose everything by being seen too tenderly with another man. And when Wahlberg stepped away, the universe didn't collapse. It just replaced him. That's how the system wins. One man says no, another says yes, and the refusal disappears into trivia. But the emotional cost doesn't disappear, because every no teaches studios the same lesson. Queer intimacy is still a risk they'd rather outsource to braver people, cheaper people, people with less to lose. Now comes the uncomfortable twist. Maybe Wahlberg wasn't afraid of gay. Maybe he was afraid of being looked at, of having his tough guy brand relabeled by one scene, of the audience deciding overnight that he isn't who they want to project onto anymore. That's what the straight tax buys you, continued projection. So where do you land? Is "I was creeped out" an honest boundary? Or is it the exact stigma that keeps queer stories trapped in the risky box? Argue it out below. Is refusing a queer role a personal right or a privilege cushioned by prejudice? 9. Michael Douglas. the almost yes that proves the system is louder than the star. If you want to understand the straight tax, don't look at the men who shouted never. Look at the ones who almost said yes and got pulled back by the leash. When Making Love was being cast in the early 80s, screenwriter Barry Sandler says Michael Douglas seriously considered the lead and went back and forth, close enough that the production waited. Then his people stepped in and talked him out of it, with the kind of blunt, panicked language that sounds less like career advice and more like a threat. Are you crazy? Kiss another man on the screen? Are you nuts? That's not just one actor's choice. That's the machine speaking through him. In that era, a leading man wasn't only selling movies, he was selling a permission slip for the audience to project their masculinity onto him. A gay love story didn't just challenge a role, it threatened the entire product label. And the wild part? Nobody had to say the quiet part out loud. The quiet part was implied. If the camera sees you being held by another man, the world might not let you be unseen again. Here's the twist. Silent fame lives for. A lot of these men weren't terrified of gay people. They were terrified of being seen, frozen into a GIF, turned into a punchline, rebranded by strangers who act like one scene is a confession. That fear is understandable on a human level, but it's also a privilege because queer actors don't get to opt out of visibility. They pay the tax just by walking into the room. So where's the line? Is Douglas's near yes proof of empathy wrestling with a brutal industry? Or proof that brand safety will always win when the stakes are highest? Drop your take, because this is where the debate gets honest. Is refusing a queer role a personal right or a luxury protected by stigma? 10. Harrison Ford. The original Avatar. Hollywood refused to let be touched. Harrison Ford is the perfect final case because he wasn't just a star, he was an avatar. The kind of leading man audiences didn't simply watch, they borrowed. When Making Love was shopping its lead, Sandler says the role was offered to Ford, and he just wasn't going to do it. And in 1980-1982, that refusal didn't exist in a vacuum. Making Love was pitched as a major studio attempt to treat gay people respectfully, and the subject alone was considered intimidating to mainstream audiences. The atmosphere was so tense that Wikipedia, citing reporting, describes a private screening where Fox owner Marvin Davis reportedly erupted at the film and stormed out. A moment that captures the era's hostility in one ugly burst. So imagine the bargain being offered to Ford. Trade the armor. Step out of the invincible straight fantasy and into a story where a man admits the truth of his desire. Not violence, not swagger, vulnerability. In a business that treats male tenderness like a brand defect, that isn't just a role. It's a risk of being relabeled. And here's the question I want you to sit with, because there's no clean answer. If you were Ford, the face of competence, the face men wanted to be, would you take the hit and help drag the culture forward? Or would you protect the contract you never asked to sign? That's the straight tax in its purest form. Not fear of gayness, fear of being seen differently and never getting your old reflection back. If you're still here at the end, you're exactly the audience Hollywood underestimated. The kind that can handle complexity without turning it into a witch hunt. So tell me in the comments where you land. Right to refuse or privilege cushioned by prejudice? And if you want more stories that don't just name names but expose the machinery that makes silence profitable, subscribe to Silent Fame. We're building the archive the industry hoped nobody would watch. So where do you land? Were these men protecting boundaries or protecting a brand built on stigma? I'm not here to hand you a verdict. I'm here to hand you the evidence and the uncomfortable questions Hollywood avoids. If you made it this far, you're the kind of viewer this industry underestimated. Drop your take in the comments and subscribe to Silent Fame. We don't do gossip. We map the machinery that makes silence profitable.